extended body. A forensic pathologist is attaching an upper thigh and a severed hand to it. There are no fingerprints, no hands and no head. The puzzle pieces don't fit together. Gore, gore, gore. This is Russian TV in a nutshell. It's all about horror, helplessness and madness, with every gruesome detail laid bare. It's a twisted picture of what's been happening to Russia for 24 years, under the grip of a maniac psychopath sick to his core. Is it possible to diagnose Putin now, before he's in the cage, when only specialists can examine his body? Back in 1986, Andrei Bukonovsky, an associate professor of the psychiatric department of Rostov Medical Institute, began creating a psychological portrait of the maniac, Andrei Chikatilo. It helped identify the serial killer and put an end to the terrible chain of murders. Today, the serial killer sits in Kremlin. He commits horrendous crimes in front of the whole world, yet there are still politicians and even nations willing to talk with this monster. Perhaps this psychological portrait will end with the delusion of negotiating with the Kremlin's Chikatilo. He is a combo of a cop and a thug. What would you do if you happened to take a shower with a gay man?
Grigori Asipashvili beats him with a stick or a strap.
In Georgia perché? Perché stava investigando sulla Cecenia.
He is a sadist. Well, I don't know. This is a medical term. I'd rather suspect him as a masochist, not a sadist.
Putin has 20 out of the 21. So that's more than enough for what's called a diagnosis.
He is a Klestakov type. Problem of Russia is not about Putin. This is a psychopathological portrait of the entire Russian nation. Putin was formed long before the KGB. He was formed in the back streets of St. Petersburg.
His sexuality remains a mystery, as he had very close relationship with cellist Sergey Antonov. Each initiate had to kiss his hand and perform oral sex on him.
When there is no access to a body, in our case Dictator Putin's body, psychological profiling becomes an essential tool for analysis. The importance of such research becomes obvious for the US intelligence agencies during the World War II. Gerald Post founded the CIA Center for Psychological Analysis and Political Behavior to compile dossiers of foreign leaders. At the same time, psychoanalysis was used to study Adolf Hitler's psychology, understanding his motives and fears, and exploits his personal vulnerabilities to win the war.
It's extremely important to know the psychology of leaders, especially those leaders that, well, control nuclear weapons, I guess, or can declare a war against humanity. And so throughout history, there's always been attempts to understand the psychology of these leaders and why they act the way they do in a destructive way. So I'm thinking of a couple of psychologists that were hired by the US government during World War II to psychoanalyze Adolf Hitler and what Hitler could do in the following years after he declared war against the world, against the United States. Hitler, it turns out these psychologists predicted precisely what Hitler would do, including up to committing suicide in the end. One of them, the Harvard psychologist that I speak about in Lele Sheabidi, or the English version, which is called Nursing Injustices, we try to model the psychoanalysis of Vladimir Putin on what these psychologists did for the United States government and the British government in psychoanalyzing Adolf Hitler. So we try to do a similar thing about Vladimir Putin. And it turns out there's some overlap between what the psychopathologies that Hitler suffered and the psychopathologies that Putin suffers.
Hitler was a determined man, strong-willed, resolute, and undoubtedly driven by his obsessions. Putin is a completely different type of person. He is an inept and a mediocre, First of all, he would have put him on the couch. And, I'd have struggled with the urge to strangle him. No, of course I wouldn't actually do it. I'm a peaceful person. But I definitely wouldn't want to talk to someone like that. He clearly had some very severe childhood traumas. On October 16, 2000, Italian journalist Antonio Russo was found dead in Georgia. What was Putin so afraid of? What secrets could an Italian journalist from Radio Radical who had come to Georgia possibly reveal?
The body of Rousseau, the journalist from Radio Radicale, was discovered in Georgia. By then, he had already recorded an interview with Putin's mother. Rousseau was apparently tortured. His body crushed beneath a truck that rolled over him repeatedly, again and again. There was nothing left of him. Just like with Artem Borovik, they took everything. His computer, all his tapes, phone, everything vanished. He took everything from Rousseau as well. Any single tape was left. Among them were tapes from Chechnya, undoubtedly interesting, but they left nothing. I remember when Putin came to power. Something terrible happened to Chechnya almost immediately, and Putin was the cause. We were shocked by the destructive power of a man who had been virtually unknown until then.
Who could have ever imagined that the Georgian-speaking woman would recognize the new Russian president as her son and openly discuss it with foreign journalists? Antonio Russo was investigating atrocities committed by the Russian army in Chechnya. He was going to publish material on murdered Chechen children, but when he discovered Vera Putina, he immediately contacted the editorial office in Rome. His colleagues from Radio Radical were ready to break a sensational story.
We were shocked when we learned he had been murdered. He disappeared, and just a few hours later his body was found near Tbilisi. Then we found out what had happened and why it happened. He was tortured and killed. He had told his mother and his cousins, who were members of Partito Radicale, that he gathered evidence proving the Russian army used unconventional weapons and committed war crimes in Chechnya. Besides, he uncovered information about Putin's biological mother. But those materials were never found. In his house in Tbilisi, everything was turned upside down. His computer, mobile phone, videotapes, and all his documents were gone. We don't know exactly what he had discovered, but we know one thing for sure. He found something and he was killed for it.
Radio Radical journalist Antonio Russo was assassinated by the Russian secret services to prevent the leak of information that could have been dangerous for Putin in the 2000s. Krystyna Kurczab-Redlich wrote a book about Vladimir Putin's childhood, in which she proved that Putin was neither born in Leningrad nor in 1952 as commonly believed.
Vera Putina was born in 1926 in the village of Terechino near Ochor, Urals region. She was born and lived there for some time with her parents. As she grew older, no longer being a young girl, she went to study nearby. It was after the Second World War, and by then, women who had the chance to study were already adults. She was a good student, but soon she met a man named Platon Privalov. They started living together, and eventually she became pregnant. One day, when she was already expecting their baby, she found a package addressed to Platon Privalov. He was away at that time. The package contained some food, and Vera was worried that it might spoil. She opened that package and discovered that it had been sent by Privalov's actual wife. Heartbroken, Vera left him, and as it often happens, returned to her parents' house. She went back to Terechino, where she gave birth to a boy named Volodya in 1950. Little Volodya was born there. in Terechino. Perhaps there was a hospital in Achor, but anyway it was nearby. It was 1950. A year later, Vera left her child with her parents and went to complete her post-graduation internship. After finishing vocational school, students were obliged to complete an internship. It was common at that time. She was sent to Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Vera lived in the student dormitory. Not far from there was a sort of a community center, where soldiers from the nearby barracks often gathered for dance parties. A man named George Osipashvili, who was indeed a very handsome man, often attended those dance parties and got interested in Vera. Frankly speaking, she was not a beauty queen at all. He knew that Vera had a child. She was delighted that there was a man ready to accept a woman with a kid. Like many men from the Caucasus, he was a great storyteller. He had truly vivid imagination and told Vera that he owned a big house and stuff like that. But when she came to his place, she soon realized there was no flooring in his dilapidated hut. When I spoke to her in 2019, she told me she didn't know what it was about him that she liked. I said, "You've probably forgotten, but it was simply love. You fell in love with him, that's all." She settled in that village of Metihi in Georgia. A year later, she asked her mom to bring her child. Of course, she missed him. When Volodya arrived, he was already 3 years old. Everything was fine while he was still small. But as he grew, the couple had their own children. His stepfather, George Osipashvili, became increasingly harsh towards Volodya. Volodya started going to school. He wasn't looking for friends. More precisely, other kids didn't want to be friends with him, as everyone knew he wasn't George's son. And you know, it was the Caucasus. In Moscow, no one would have cared about that. But there, illegitimate children were treated differently. The boy was called a bastard, and other people, even adults, were saying bad things about his mother. He took it very personally.
Demons are tearing Putin apart. Putin the spy is carefully hiding his inner hell. Candle smoke curls in the air, mingling with smell of incense. Putin kisses an icon and pretends to pray. He looks mournful during a midnight mass. He does his best to seem normal. Doesn't that remind you of the maniac Chikatilo, appearing to be a decent family man and respected colleague? From the supply department, carrying a travel briefcase with a knife, a towel, several lengths of rope, and a jar of Vaseline. What did Athenite elders suspect? Why did they drive him away? I know that Putin has a penchant for pagan rituals. He is fond of shamanism and so on. He takes it very seriously. That's why I feel so sorry for the shaman Alexander Gabishev, who most probably will spend the rest of his life in prison, at least as long as Putin is in power, as he, the shaman, dared summon spirits against Putin. I plan to write an essay called Klestakov the Tsar. So is Klestakov. Klestakov is nobody. Gogo saw him as nobody, but he was the Antichrist, in fact. I won't say that Putin is an Antichrist. I would say he's not up to that level yet. Like Klestakov, he is nobody. What does it mean to be nobody? To be nobody means to be anybody, a different person for different people. He told George Bush Jr. that he was a very religious man. Bush looked into his eyes and saw he was indeed an honest, ordinary Christian. But it was Bush who was an ordinary Christian, not Putin. Putin is neither ordinary nor religious. I'm not sure. Maybe he believes in shamanism. He is a believer, but he's definitely not a Christian. He is small. He obviously suffered traumas in childhood and youth, and became very insecure and apprehensive. I'm not a psychiatric specialist of any sort, but I'll dare say that he demonstrates clear signs of paranoia. It is evident not only from Putin's public behavior, with dozens of bodyguards, and all those crazy excessive security measures. But it's Putin's family history and personal life that has always shocked me. Top secret, no names, no last names, no information at all. Everything is shrouded in mystery. There is no such secrecy anywhere in the world, and I think it has never existed. North Korea? Come on. Kim Jong-un and other dictators like him are just showmen compared with Putin.
Why did he reject a woman just 2 days before their wedding? And why did he marry Lyudmila when he was 32 according to his birth certificate, though he was actually 34, 2 years older? He married Lyudmila only to be able to go abroad, because he already knew that he would be moving to East Germany. It was impossible to do so without being married.
His wife describes absolutely sadistic behavior towards her when he courted her. As Americans call it, let me remember, right? A control freak. So, he makes a date, Lyudmila comes, and he watches her for an hour.
Zero empatia, zero.
Zero empathy. Absolutely zero empathy. His attitude to Lyudmila proves it. For example, in this book, she described their life in Germany. They lived on the 3rd or 4th floor without elevator. Imagine the situation. She had 2 kids, one in a stroller, the other one in her arms, and groceries on top of that. And she had to walk upstairs alone. Germans used to say, "How come? Vladimir, why don't you help?" German neighbors always helped her, but not him.
He is indeed a psychopathic personality, sadist and psychopath, a rare combination, unlike that we see in the movies nowadays. I don't think he's a pure sadist, though his behavior with his wife shows me some signs of it. But sadists enjoy their emotions. They feel satisfaction when they torture someone. I don't think Putin feels satisfied, nor does he feel unsatisfied.
When they were having a date, each time he was 1 or 2 hours late, and she was waiting for him. As she wrote, she didn't know why she was waiting.
He has another family with Alina Kabaeva, and they have 2 sons together, but he is keeping it a secret. He hides his second family, his sons and daughters. Why? He is a free man. He could have married Kabaeva officially and live happily ever after. There seems to be some sort of pathology behind it. He is afraid of showing his personal life. He fears showing his children. He is just an average Joe, plain as porridge. This is why Yeltsin chose him, as Putin didn't pose a threat at him at all. He is a coward. We all saw that during COVID-19. I mean those nights of long tables. Situations say it all. He is so afraid of his own life. Putin showed great promise, not only in the West but also in Russia. However, the fact that he came from the KGB, Sergey Kolovev always emphasized how important that was. On the other hand, Anatoly Sobchak claimed there was no need to fear Putin. If I were him, I would have been a bit cautious because it's still unclear why Sobchak died. When I saw him on the TV for the first time, everything became clear for me. I still believe that my first impressions was absolutely correct. There were clips from Putin's speech. Maybe it was an interview, but it doesn't matter anymore. He said, "I was told that." Then he paused for a moment, shrugged, and corrected himself. "I was reported that." That's when I realized that he's a Klestikov type. Remember that Gogol's plot? Klestikov boasts about being a big boss and having a clerk-like subordinate, an office rat, a pen pusher. He just passes him by. That's how Klestikov saw him, as the big boss, and others were just regular office rats. Putin is very much alike. He was still in the KGB rat. All those who say that Putin was formed long before the KGB are right. He was formed in the back streets of St. Petersburg. He has been a yob his entire life. Putin is a collective unconscious of Russian society, unconscious of the subconscious, whatever. Freud himself disliked the term subconscious. It is something that cannot be formulated. It controls you, yet you can't logically explain it. He is a psycho. He has no sympathy for human life, and that may stem from his childhood. When he was a kid, he was often beaten in the back streets. pituitary delusions that crept into his consciousness long time ago. For example, he fears that somebody might collect his feces to extract his DNA, or let us take his fear of revealing his kids' and personal life. These are pathologies that can't be rationalized. This is another proof that he can't be considered a rational actor. He is small and unattractive. I can't judge his sexual stamina. Anyway, he is not the type of man who wins women's hearts, and he wants it so badly. He has always wanted it, but clearly he's mostly failed. I believe that Putin's complexes stem from sexual frustration and unfulfilled macho fantasies. He is certainly very jealous, yes, this is true. I believe he's a very jealous person, and of the fame as well. He envies his closest allies for their fame. He keeps emphasizing that it was him who decided to attack Ukraine, him who decided to attack Georgia. Of course, it is important to him. At the same time, it's another manifestation of a little man complex. Putin is a non-believer, though he's very superstitious. He believes in rituals, but not in the spirit. He believes in himself and in the power of money. As they say, cash works wonders. He believes that money doesn't come from the devil, rather money can defeat the devil, in plain terms. When Putin rose to power, it was Pugachev who brought him to church. He explained the church could become an important tool for shaping public opinion. Him being a secret service agent, with keen grasp of manipulation. Putin used to cater his own interest while using problems for the rest of the country, but it didn't make him a believer. The fact that he can kiss the cross or the Quran makes him neither a Christian nor a Muslim. This is just a window dressing to win over the people who genuinely believe. For sure, he's taking revenge, compensating for his unattractive appearance and the traumas of his childhood and youth. He is taking revenge on the entire human race for what he had to deal with in the fall of the 1989 in Dresden. Back then, trembling with fear, he awaited the attack on the KGB headquarters, convinced that everyone, including himself, would be chopped to death. Nursing Injustices is a title of the study by Fredo Arias-King, which explores Vladimir Putin's paradoxes through the lens of his psychosexuality. In his research, the scholar argues that, much like Dostoevsky's novel and Hitchcock's films, Putin's idea will eventually be viewed as nothing more than a surreal mirage. Putin's machismo is a consequence of trauma and inner weakness. This becomes clear even with a basic understanding of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic concepts such as projection, compensation, and projective identification. Putin's conservative values and homophobia are merely clinical efforts to divert attention of his enemies and inner demons, and eventually create a new identity. Western Soviet studies have struggled to comprehend Kremlin's intentions or predict its next steps. Yet Putin adds another layer of complexity, especially in the context of aggression against Ukraine.
It just happens that I have a lot of background in this subject by way of my parents, who were helping, treating, or rather counseling, in those days in Mexico, which was horrible, gay men in denial. In other words, homosexual men who deny their identity, which is a very important part of their identity, if you think about it. And so every day, these people lived in fear of being discovered. And anybody who hides that massive part of their identity obviously is going to suffer, and it's going to have psychopathologies. These people would come in very bad shape to see my parents, and I guess it was by word of mouth that they discovered, because my parents did not advertise. They never charged them. It was all pro bono. And some of these people became even almost part of the family simply because, they would come back and they were grateful. Others disappeared. What's interesting is that they were famous people. And I remember recognizing some of them and saying, wait, isn't that? And my parents would be like, don't tell anybody in school that this person came or that you met them. But they would come in very bad shape, and even the first things they would ask my parents is, how can I become normal? Can you imagine how sad? They think of themselves as abnormal, as inferior. And that's what psychologists called internalized homophobia. In other words, they suffer so much beating and so much humiliation that they start to believe that there's something really wrong with them. And so they would come and say, look, they would pull out a cigarette and start smoking and say, I have a wife, I have kids, I have a career, a reputation, but I also have this other identity. Now, Mexico has changed, thank goodness, since then, but I can only imagine in countries that have not changed and that are still very homophobic. I'm thinking, of course, Leningrad in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, when Putin probably discovered that he was homosexual. And then Putin, well, you know, had to deal with this in a very homophobic environment, like millions of other gays throughout history and intolerant societies. I mean, not all of them, of course, grow up in Canada or Sweden or the Czech Republic where nobody bothers them, right? And they're very fortunate. And by the way, those gay men that are not in denial, that are encouraged to be themselves and not be ashamed of who they are, they live on average the exact same as everyone else. And they die from the same diseases as everyone else on average. Whereas gay men in denial, or gay people in denial, but apparently it's men principally, they live 5 years less on average than men who do not hide their sexual identity, whether they be straight or gay, interestingly. So it's not being gay that kills them, it's denying that part of their identity and suffering all their lives. And they tend to die from diseases that are a lot more stress-related and hard diseases, you know, than the average person. And so my parents, of course, would counsel them and would encourage them to do what they should do, which is, look, I know it's hard, but you need to come out. You need to tell your wife, you need to tell your boss, you need to tell your children if they're grown up, you know, and sort of be yourself. And you never know, you might find happiness. And you know what's funny, because ever since then, I mean, there's a collection, an entire collection, if you look around you, of stories of sports people, of actors, of actresses, of, you know, famous businessmen and whatever, that have followed exactly that advice, even late in life, in their 40s, 50s. And they say that it was like a piano being lifted from their shoulders. They didn't need to hide from the world anymore. And the world accepted them better than they expected, which is interesting, you know? So Putin suffers all the symptoms. In fact, my parents were only following the steps of a previous psychoanalyst who was I guess, первый открыватель, or the one that first discovered a lot of these psychopathologies and diagnosed them in several books. And his name was Edmund Bergler. So here I have Edmund Bergler's one of his many books. Well, I think 4 of them, just on this topic, you know? So in this book, you know, he basically recounts the experiences of counseling and treating, according to him, about 1,000 gay men in denial. And that was his practice. You see, he did full time, unlike my parents. He did that full time. So he published 4 books. And if you read these books, they're essentially a biography of Vladimir Putin. If you look at what his patients are saying, what they're doing, what their fears are, what their hopes are, what their, you know, daily challenges are, you will read in those pages Vladimir Putin. So what I did for Lilieshe Abedi, for Nursing Injustices, was I took the symptoms from what Bergler, you know, listed in his books, the ones that are especially observable. In other words, the others I excluded because they can only be discerned by sitting Putin on a couch and asking him, well, tell me about your childhood, and assuming that Putin is truthful, then, you know, we can add more symptoms. But the ones that we can observe, just because he's a public figure, plus those symptoms that appear in my father's own book, published in 1997, that he discovered by counseling gay men in denial those years in Mexico, you reach 21 symptoms of gay men in denial. Putin has 20 out of the 21. So that's more than enough for what's called a diagnosis. The problem is that, well, universities and the academy, they really don't like to talk about this. They do not want to talk about this because they think that it's anti-gay, that you're basically embarrassing them or exhibiting them or making them feel less. I would say it's the exact opposite. Because if we want to help somebody who feels that much stress, first we need to, ask the right questions, and we need to be honest with ourselves and say, look, you suffer from this, and therefore you can do that. It's almost as if, like in another era, I don't know, people with cancer would not go to the doctor because they figured that it was a shame or it was a sign of witchcraft or something like that. Until scientists discovered, no, it can be treated in some way. The same thing with homosexual men, but it's a very charged thing, obviously. So how do we know that Putin is a gay man in denial? It's very simple. First, he fits 20 out of the 21 symptoms that both Bergler and my father explored. Two, that's the theoretical. So I base myself mostly on the theoretical aspect. But then psychoanalytical tools. But then there's also the historical tools. My co-author, Dr. J. Michael Waller of Leleshi Abidi, or Nursing Injustices, he is an expert on the KGB. And he wrote the book on the KGB back in the 90s. He probably the best book on what happened to the KGB after the Soviet collapse. And he has researched the KGB's history as well. So the Чрезвычайная комиссия, or the Cheka Lenins, was established, staffed by, Dzerzhinsky. Basically what he wanted was to hire gay men in denial in Russia that would have no problems killing, repressing, humiliating other people, because for them that was a form of catharsis. It was a form of revenge. So these Bolsheviks knew very well how to manipulate human psychology to create, their institutions and to remain in power for decades. Sometimes I wonder, reading Russian history, how is it possible to find people that you can order, like, go starve that entire village in Ukraine in the Holodomor, and they would obey you without question? I mean, like, what kind of people are this? Where did they find them, How could they obey such orders and to implement such horrible things as the Gulag or the Holodomor or the Great Repressions? And that's the answer. The Cheka, the Чрезвычайная комиссия, focused on finding people like Vladimir Putin, who harbored an innate revenge instinct. In other words, they harbored a desire to avenge themselves of those that humiliated them all their lives. And for them, it's perfectly normal. They say, they humiliated me growing up. In school, they used to tease me, they would call me old names, or I had to hide my identity. I had to pretend I also liked girls when I didn't, and that was a humiliation against me. So now I am taking my revenge. So in Putin's mind, he is perfectly correct in destroying Russia. And yes, Russia, because to me, that's his ultimate goal, is to take revenge against those that humiliate him. For him, Russia and Ukraine are the same thing. They are the Soviet Union, where he grew up in Leningrad, that humiliated him. So now he's trying to destroy, unconsciously, Russia and Ukraine. So Putin has made so many mistakes in this war that cannot be explained by anything other than what Edmund Bergler, who, by the way, studied under Sigmund Freud, and then went on only to dedicate his life, again, counseling 1,000 homosexuals and then writing these books. According to Bergler, he discovered, and you can read this in his books, a strong masochistic tendency in gay men. And he thought that was one of his mistakes, by the way. He thought that the masochism came from being a homosexual. Whereas later, it was discovered that it's not from being a homosexual at all. It's by hiding their homosexual identity, where this desire for revenge and this masochistic tendency, provoking other people unnecessarily, causing great destruction, provoking so that they will fight against you, they will hit you, they will humiliate you, and then you can say, I knew it, I'm a victim, no one likes me, I'm such a victim, the world hates me, why does this always happen to me? So Bergler, the problem with poor Edmund Bergler is that he didn't really have a control group. They say in the social sciences, you need a control group. In other words, he needed to compare his neurotic homosexual patients with normal, open homosexuals who live happy in a tolerant society like Sweden or, San Francisco. He did not have that group because in those days, being an open homosexual was very rare. So, he had to work mostly with just the neurotic homosexual in denial who came to his studio in very bad shape, kind of like they would come to my parents in very bad shape as well, and pull out a cigarette and say, "Doctor, turn me into a goddamn normal." In fact, I'll never forget that from Bergler's patients. And he writes that in his book, "Please, doctor, turn me into a goddamn normal," Poor people. And so, unfortunately, Bergler did not have that control group because if he had lived in the modern era and he could talk to gays in San Francisco who were happy, who were even married to each other and stuff, he would have realized, oh, you know what? A lot of these masochistic and psychopathological things happen not because of homosexuality per se, but because of their denial. So this field has evolved. In fact, there's an academic journal called the Journal of Homosexuality. It's called. It's a peer-reviewed journal written by psychologists, psychoanalysts, who, by the way, are very gay affirmative. What's called gay affirmative means that they're not discriminating against gay people at all. Many of them are probably gay themselves, and they just have their own academic journal, which is great. And if I read many studies, more modern than Bergler, in that academic journal. And finally, people have caught up with the fact that now we have a control group, which is open and healthy gays versus, neurotic, closed gays. And Putin has all the symptoms of a gay man, an active gay man in denial. Because in Russia, for some reason, the concept latently gay is more prevalent. But Bergler did not study latent gay. So my parents didn't either. So I'm not familiar with that topic at all. I think active gays that deny their homosexuality are the ones that have been the most studied. And by the way, Bergler noticed one thing, and he called it the first symptom. In other words, the telltale sign. I mean, the most prevalent of all those symptoms, 21 or even more symptoms of gay men in denial, the number one, which is always common between them, is how they treat other gays. How they treat gays who are open. For some strange reason, and Bergler wrote about this, gay men in denial, closeted homosexuals, have a lot of solidarity between them. They have incredible solidarity between them. Even across borders. It's amazing the fraternity that they have formed. But what they have in common is how much they neurotically hate, gay men who are open and proud, and so they obsessively hate these people. And if you look at Putin, well, it's an issue with him, right? Putin it's a very common thing, either him personally, but more his allies, including a certain Volodin, who apparently is also a gay man in denial, and yet he's the one that every time they do one of these anti-LGBT whatever Q laws in Russia, he's the one that stands up and applauds, and he's the one that takes this law in the Duma. But yet these people attack open and proud gays as if they were like the worst people on earth. So Bergler noticed this very strange paradox. Why is it that these gay men not only deny their identity, but also viciously attack gays that are proud and open and don't deny their sexual identity? He explored a few theories, but I mean, that's only academic. It's probably not so relevant to speak about them.
Putin grew up as a weak and sensitive boy with latent sexual orientation. He lived in a homophobic state where coming out would lead to physical humiliation, beatings, and criminal prosecution. He had to suppress his true self and pretend to be a tough guy, try to befriend other tough guys, and overcome humiliation by humiliating others. I once spoke with a friend from Berlin a doctor who happens to be gay. When I asked him how he came to understand his orientation, he responded with a simple question. Who did you dream about during your teenage years? When I answered, girls, of course, he said, I dreamed of boys, so how can you go against your orientation? I believe Putin was the kind of gay man who dreamt of boys, but could never admit it. Not to others, and not even to himself. He tried to suppress his homosexuality, becoming a chronic neurotic, and later paranoic obsessed with insane overvalued ideas. His attempts turned into pure madness. He wanted to make history. This was one of his overvalued ideas. He wanted to prove that he was a badass, not that pathetic gay he saw himself as a child. He was not a miserable faggot, as they used to say in Russia. He perceived himself negatively, nothing but a maggot because of his homosexuality. He overcame it after all. He still has to fight and prove to himself and others that he is a tough guy. He is not a Nancy boy, but a great leader who will go down in Russian history as the one who unified Russian lands, recreated Russian Empire, and established the Third Reich. Hitler wanted to become a creator of the Third German Reich, the heir of the Holy Roman Empire and German Empire established by the Hohenzollern royal dynasty, and Putin wanted to make history as the creator of the Third Russian Reich, the heir of Romanov's Reich and Soviet Reich, that is, the USSR. This paranoid overvalue idea pushed him to begin a full-scale war in Ukraine. Injustices, Fredo Arias-King writes the following. Former Russian domestic intelligence officer Alexander Litvenko, a veteran from the Federal Security Service who defected to London, wrote an article in 2006 describing Putin as a paedophile, with an interest in small boys. Litvenko said he learned the secret in the late 1990s, when Putin became the FSB director and was preparing for the presidency. He began to seek and destroy any compromising materials that the KGB had collected in the FSB Internal Security Directorate, which showed him having sex with some underage boys. A Russian government's death squad later murdered Litvenko with radioactive polonium, with a British inquiry later concluding that Putin probably gave the orders personally.
Alexander Litvinenko, in fact, after they discovered polonium and why he was dying in a hospital, said, Putin killed me because I called him a pedophile. I believe that. I mean, because it's very unusual for a homosexual man to be a pedophile. Very unusual. In fact, it's not more usual than an average person. You know, apparently it's independent from sexual identity. You know, adults who prey on children. So if Putin preyed on children, that means that he is an unusual homosexual in denial. It means he's more than that. He is a highly traumatized homosexual in denial. So it probably is true. I mean, there's no evidence. Apparently he destroyed it. But what we do have is like Platon talked about the shadows in the cave, that you don't see the object, you see its shadows. Why did Putin's career was so unusual in the KGB? You know, he really wanted to be in the first chief directorate and be a dashing James Bond, and you know, and he was stuck in Dresden in the, you know, another division of the KGB, which had to do with, you know, nothing glamorous, you know. And so apparently there was something in Putin's reputation, career inside the KGB that is like, no, this we cannot be too close to, we cannot promote Putin. He also married kind of late, I think, and Ludmila talked about how she had to chase him, she had to convince him. In fact, he was always in his judo classes, and that was his identity. Being with other men and wrestling other men and being close to other men and having fraternal relations with other men and smelling other men. That was his thing. And then suddenly, when in his 30s, I think, he got married to Ludmila, and he, had 2 kids and had to conform with the norms of society, like so many millions of other men like him who, all right, fine, I will do it, just to my career or my reputation or whatever. So there's many unusual things about Putin. But the fact that Alexander Litvinenko obviously knew a lot about the KGB, I think even in the KGB, he was of a similar, if not higher, he was a higher rank than Vladimir Putin. But there's another KGB officer who was in charge of the Paris station. Of course, we're talking about Sergey Zhirnov. And Sergey Zhirnov has been appearing in many interviews and channels like Gordon in Ukraine and Diagnoz Putina with Sergey Antonov and others, where he has repeated that, yes, inside the KGB, we knew that Putin was a gay man. So what? The thing is, these are the consequences. And
I would distinguish between 2 types of homophobia, political and internalized. Political homophobia is the one imposed by the government and the state propaganda as a sort of normative behavior. This is an outer aspect. On the other hand, there is an internalized homophobia based on a bunch of sexual deviations, complexes, inhibitions that Putin obviously has. I'm not a doctor to diagnose Putin, but it seems obvious that he tries to suppress his numerous inner impulses. In fact, his attempts to suppress his homosexuality continuously instigates his madness and became one of the reasons why we ended up in the current state of affairs. I am neither a medical expert nor a therapist. I must note, I can only judge from the outside. From the outside, it seems that Putin has a whole lot of sexual hang-ups. It is still unclear whether they deal with homosexuality itself, or rather with homosexual pedophilia. I emphasize, I am not a doctor, but I believe that this is where you should look for the answers to your question. Yet Putin seems to be a person with certain sexual disorders and distorted self-perception, specifically inadequate perception, and realize of his own sexuality. Naturally, this suggests that his current behavior is influenced by old, unresolved trauma, enhanced by masculine communities he has surrounded himself with. From small sport clubs to large sports schools, those are highly masculine, highly suppressive communities, with complex hierarchy. I think this caused even more sexual traumas. I know a man who accidentally spilled the beans that he had sex with Putin. From my point of view, this fact means nothing bad. I mean, people's sex lives are nobody else's business. But what is actually bad is that Putin's environment and target audience in Russia are mostly homophobic. In order to hide his homosexuality, he initiates disgusting repression against sexual minorities, passes laws on gay propaganda, stirs hysteria in mass media. Few people realize that, till 2010, Russia was among the most tolerant countries for sexual minorities. Later, the situation rapidly worsened. As a result of the state propaganda on TV, this is a crime. I believe that this is the reason why Putin's sexuality must be explored and revealed. If he himself didn't hype on this topic and didn't prosecute gay people, there would be nothing to discuss. Sadly, there is. He who smelt it, dealt it, as they say. But this is exactly what's happening. Diverse sexual preferences are a common thing. In a political elite of many countries, it becomes a crucial factor in many places around the world, and especially in Russia, as Putin himself instigated intolerance towards sexual minorities. Those in power who happen to be gay team up. In fact, Putin has extra leverage against them, another reason for blackmail. He has collected evidence and photos exposing many people in power, among which parliament speakers, head of key committees, key ministers, chairs of key state corporations and key governors. We all know who these people are. I would like to repeat, people's sex lives are their own businesses, and there is nothing to discuss. But if one wants to scratch below the surface of Russian politics, it is essential to realize that the leverage of influence are not all about money. They often involve blackmailing for being gay, sexual escapades, and discrediting contacts. All intelligent agencies, Putin's former intelligent agent as we remember, know it to be one of the most effective instruments of pressure. Putin's visit to Mongolia is yet another hot topic. For instance, information surfaced suggesting that the formal part of the visit was followed by an informal one, with some sort of ritual and related activities. I wasn't a witness, of course, but I know people from his inner circle who take this seriously and stress that their boss is very much serious about it. I know people who use astrology to make decisions on a particular day. This is not something new to the current Russian political elite.
Our late friend Vlad Mamyshev Monroe once shared a story about being invited to an event called Alexander Dugin's Special Group. When Dugin was not yet a famous person in Russia, he was a leader of Bohemian community in St. Petersburg and had followers, so to say. Vlad happened to attend one of those events. He said that he had to escape in fear, because to become a part of Dugin's inner circle, each initiate had to kiss his hand and perform oral sex on him.
Did Hitler have an opportunity to negotiate with the West and save his life? Many historians argued that he did, but Hitler himself did not believe in it, realizing that any attempt to retreat would mean his downfall. Starting from the 1990s, Putin's crimes are comparable to those of the Nazis in terms of the number of victims. Though being Yeltsin's successor and self-proclaimed Democrat from Anatoly Sobchak's team, Putin, in fact haunted by internalized homophobia, his dictatorial nature, driven by multiple psychosexual disorders, manifested itself from the first years in power. Hitler, who came to power through elections, immediately began terrorizing Germany. Putin began his ruling in strikingly similar way by blowing up Russian citizens and threatening to snuff and flush non-Russians down the toilet. He is a political zero. In Russia, he would have never achieved anything without perfectly confirming the system's demand.
Burglar, again, did not have a lot to work with in those days. And he was a genius, and he was a первый открыватель. But like with any research, like with any new sort of, observations, people have to build on it. So my father built on burglar, but paradoxically using the tools of another Freud student named Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung discovered archetypes and how powerful we are controlled. In essence, our psychology is determined by our archetypes, or the archetypes manifest themselves in our dreams and our poetry in our fears, in our hopes. So the archetypes, are powerful symbols that govern us in a way. So my father has spent half a century studying Jungian archetypes and how they apply to human psychology, and he's published numerous books. But the one book he published about, his patients and how their archetypes, homosexual men in denial, and it turns out my father discovered, additional symptoms that a burglar had not noticed. My father noticed that in the poetry of gay men, 3 very powerful archetypes manifest themselves a lot more than in poetry by men who are not homosexual. And those are the archetypes of puncture, so mutilation, and poison, interestingly. And with Putin, we also see evidence of his obsession with poison. That's more than obvious. In fact, I was very, very close to Yuri Petrovich Chekashikhin, and I remember well how he died in 2003. I had a number of other friends in the Russian opposition that have died from poisoning. So Putin seems to be obsessed not only with poisoning, but poisoning in a way that shows the entire world that it was him. Even though he denies it, the poisons they use, such as polonium with Alexander Litvinenko, or Novichok with Navalny, with Pyotr Verzilov, and with others. Putin wants the world to know that he is poisoning. Putin wants to know the world how powerful he is by using poisons, which to a normal person, I shouldn't use that word, but to a person that has not suffered what Putin has suffered, this is contradictory, Why would you think you are a brave person, humiliating other people by poisoning them, by being a world leader of a nuclear power? What you're showing is that you're a coward, because you, unlike, other leaders like Gorbachev that used to respect the man in the street, Putin wants to show his disrespect and his desire to humiliate people by being a very powerful man who orders his secret services to poison his opponents so that they not only die, but they suffer even more while dying. Just simple wood, like for the rest of us, or some kind of, like we all have a decoration behind our bed. They sell them in IKEA. But whatever reason, Putin has swords and daggers. So that was made especially for him. Putin is obsessed with mutilation. Why? Because he mutilates Ukraine. He does not need those territories. He does not need Crimea. He does not need the Donbass. As Kuchma once asked, does Russia need more territory after the Tuzla crisis? Kuchma was like, but why would Russia need more territory? It's not territory that Putin is after. I think, in my theory, Putin is after mutilation and showing the world that he can mutilate Ukraine. Ungrateful Ukraine, he can mutilate. And if you go even further, and the poor baby was starving to death, and nobody knew he was starving to death, and then he survived miraculously. So Freud had this theory, it's never been proven, by the way, that homosexuals are starved babies, the result of traumatized, starved babies. So the theory of Burglar is not that homosexuals love other men. His theory is that they are afraid of women because it reminds them unconsciously of their mother that almost killed them. In their mind, mother wanted to kill me. Therefore, I need to escape women. They're afraid of women. They're deathly afraid of women. And in a sexual way, of course. As friends, no, of course not. But in a sexual way, they're afraid of women. And that's why they gravitate towards other men, because they don't feel them as a threat. Of course, these are just theories by Freud, and that Burglar adopted them. But it fits with Putin's obsession with Ukraine. Why Ukraine and not northern Kazakhstan? Well, Ukraine, yeah, we can say political scientists who have other tools, of course, use the theory that, well, Ukraine is closer to the West, Ukraine wants NATO, Ukraine wants EU, and Putin feels threatened. It could be true. But a pure Freudian, who has, not done more research since Freud, would say something like, because he wants to show that he can be more powerful than his mother, he can humiliate his mother, he can mutilate his mother.
Back in the 1990s, Putin began fulfilling his basic needs, according to Maslow's hierarchy. Once he met those needs and became a prosperous man, he began to get off the trolley. Apparently, he was batty in the brain since childhood, but it surfaced only when his basic needs were no longer a concern.
Vera Putin returned her son, Vovka, to her parents' house. She later described that scene. Vovka was crying so hard, but I didn't even comfort him, because I was afraid that I would start crying myself, and I didn't even hug him. Imagine how heartbreaking it might have been for him, and for that poor woman, who would never again have a chance to see her son. His new father, a very special man, was Stalin's admirer. Before the World War II, he had been an NKVD member. As part of NKVD division, he went to liberate Estonia. Putin had to enroll in the first grade again, not only because of the low level of education in the Georgian village he used to live, but also, I believe he didn't speak Russian very well.
I can assume that, as a child, he was sexually abused in the back streets of St. Petersburg.
There was a prison-like hierarchy in the back streets where he grew up, where those at the top could do anything to those beneath them. A bully from the back streets remained a bully for the rest of his life. Nobody taught little Volodya the difference between right and wrong. Instead, he was raised in a harsh environment, where his stepfathers would beat him with straps or sticks.
After all, there were many times when he unintentionally revealed his hidden homosexuality. Here is a vivid example. An American journalist once asked him, "What would you do if you happened to take a shower with a gay man nearby?" A normal response might be, "I would do nothing, continue taking a shower. What am I supposed to do in a shower? I am just washing my body, that's all." In contrast, a latent homosexual trying to suppress his orientation might realize that he wouldn't be able to withstand the temptation, and his homosexuality could be exposed. Putin's response reflected it. When answering that question, he became defensive and claimed that he was the top-notch judoka, implying that gay men would probably be in trouble. I can't remember his exact words, but this is what the essence of his reply. This is one of the many instances. There are multiple times when he would reveal his fears and complexes.
Nobody raised him properly. He was brought up in the spirit of, I wouldn't call it hatred, but a deep disdain for women. I believe that for many years he couldn't forgive his mother for abandoning him. In a first-person interview, a journalist asked him, "Were there any people in your life who let you down?" He sat silent for a long time and then answered, "Yes, there were. But my friends have never let me down." You see, his friends didn't betray him, but who did? For sure, he meant his mother. He never understood why she did what she did. Nobody ever explained it to him. His mother and his sisters searched for him, but they were told that he joined KGB and they should stop looking for him. His mother's parents, who had sent young Putin to Leningrad, lied to her, saying that they sent him to a boarding school. No details. They actually broke all communication between the mother and the son.
There are striking similarities between Putin and Hitler. Both sadists responsible for the mass slaughter of civilians share severe mental pathologies. Putin's fascination with the Russian philosopher Ilyin, a key ideologist of Russian fascism, has borne fruit. Those dangerous ideas found a fertile soil in ill-educated and mentally disturbed Putin. The same is true about Hitler, a second-rate and psychopath who embraced Rudolf Hess's misanthropic ideas. He is a latent homosexual who has repressed his homosexuality. Why? As a person who repressed his true self, he will hate those who refuse to go against their nature and live happily, who they are. embracing their natural sexual orientation. Putin has to live someone else's life and pretend to be someone he is not. Throughout his life, he has been pretending to be a heterosexual man, an authoritative and strong personality.
In 1953, Vladimir Putin proclaimed a broad amnesty, releasing many convicted criminals who settled throughout Russia, including the backstreets of Leningrad, where Volodya grew up. This is how he picked up criminal slang he would later use so frequently. Take his infamous phrase, "We will snuff and flush them down the toilet." Who was he referring to? The Chechens, for sure.
Putin was formed long before the KGB. He was
У меня были очень разные знакомые в Москве скажем, в 70-е, 80-е годы. И, в частности, я так по касательной, но проходил и невдалеке от
particularly widespread among criminals. It used to be a norm among criminals back then. I mean, you know, about the phenomenon of sexual humiliation. I know a bit about prison rules. My uncle Eugene Chidman, a decorous old dunce, was a criminal who spent 12 years of his life in Soviet prison. My father was a scholar, a doctor of physics and a professor, but his brother was a criminal. It sometimes happens in Jewish families. Despite his criminal background, my uncle was quite intelligent. He used to win chess tournaments in prison, and he was fond of Fyodor Dostoevsky. He told my father a lot about life in prison. To rise in the prison hierarchy, one didn't have to rape anyone, though such practice wasn't considered as something shameful. I mean, it wasn't shameful to be an active homosexual. Only passive homosexuals were disdained. However, rape wasn't a must at all. Over time, rapists were condemned. And only convicts who cooperated with the prison administration continued such practices. It becomes a form of pressure imposed by the administration on rebellious prisoners. Eventually, criminals altogether abandon such practices. Putin's Russia is drowning in gore, hopelessness, depression, and schizophrenia. Hundreds of thousands of people have already been grinded down in the chopper of war, while the living dead among the pop stars and doing freak shows in the state media. This is the reflection of Putin's demons tearing him from inside. This is his personal vendetta not just against Ukraine, but against the whole world and his own people. He avenges fellow Russians for humiliations and had to suffer as a child, and for personal hell he has been living through. Russia led by Putin has no future. He leads this country to disaster. Regime change and the physical elimination of Putin will be the only chance to survive.
First of all, he's responsible for the Chechen wars, for all those facts we know, for all that evidence we have seen, and for what has yet to come to light. He is responsible for the aggression against Georgia and the war against Ukraine. From the very beginning, we, the editorial office of Radio Radicale, have stated that Vladimir Putin is primarily responsible for all these crimes. Consequently, Putin should face justice. Peace without justice can't and will not persist. Many countries around the world have effective instruments for international justice, namely the International Criminal Court, which has already issued an arrest warrant to hold Putin accountable for some of his crimes. So far, for only a few of the atrocities he has committed. There are still many crimes for which Putin should be held accountable. We hope that the International Criminal Court will soon launch the trial against Putin, and he will finally face a tribunal.
Russian liberals occasionally state that Putin is a foreign matter in Russian society. When we get rid of him, a beautiful Russia of the future will come. There will be no Russia of the future. Well, for sure some sort of country named Russia will still exist in the future, but not a beautiful one. For now, Russia is a criminal state. The German philosopher Karl Jaspers suggested this term. Any country can commit crimes, but a criminal state is the one that can't survive without committing crimes. Everything it does is a crime. There is something worse than a criminal state, a criminal society shaped for less than a quarter century. For sure, this is a pretty short time, although Hitler took only half of that. A criminal consciousness, a criminal social consciousness, has been thriving in Russia twice as long than Germany. Russia's criminal consciousness is much deeper rooted than the one in Germany in 1945. It was much easier to reshape German society. Germany is a much smaller country than Russia in terms of population and area. It was divided into 4 occupied zones. The whole country was occupied. So each occupation zone was subject to true denazification, as Putin likes to say. Nobody will ever occupy Russia. It's virtually impossible. Therefore, neither the West nor noble Russian citizens will not be able to reshape Russian society. Putin's personal hell. Hidden stigma causes confusion that can lead to psychopathologies. There are several studies suggesting that coming out has positive impacts on homosexuals, releasing anxiety and boosting self-esteem. I think it would be a great practice, especially in Russia, where homosexuality is now considered as something shameful and socially unacceptable. I think it's too late. Putin should have been helped when he was a teenager. If he hadn't grown up in a repressive environment where gay men were so heavily stigmatized, he might have become someone entirely different. He could have become a fashion designer or a hairstylist. He could have worked here, in Berlin. There are many pretty beauty salons in this city. He could have become a hairdresser, living a fulfilling, happy life. Instead, he chose to be unhappy, bringing so much pain to millions of people.